Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I kind of been having this thought about a project, and I've been kind of laying down the groundworks for it for a while, sort of various notes and ideas, and it's a kind of a way of responding to an idea um, about the sort of the perceived naturalness of capitalism. Often you hear this kind of refrain that what capitalism is market exchange, and that what communism is, or what socialism is, or what any other ism that isn't capitalism is the power of the state to prevent market exchange, people selling things to one another, and there's so much to be said about this. Um, and it becomes very easy as somebody who is, quite versed in these sorts of matters to be very high-handed and, oh no, how could you be so ignorant and all that kind of stuff. And I can't stand that. Um, the purpose of, I think, trying to be informed about something isn't then to turn around and disempower or kind of talk down to somebody who maybe perhaps isn't as informed. And because all you're doing then is it's the service of your own ego. And so the thing I'm trying to write at the moment is what the working title of the book is just called The Rule of Capital. And that's my way of describing what capitalism is. And everybody from Karl Marx to Polanyi to Michael Parenti, or to every great kind of Marxist intellectual has done it and will do it infinitely better than I can. And I'm not trying to speak at a theoretical level. What I'm trying to do is present a clear picture as to what capitalism is. And capital is the rule of capital. Capitalism is the rule of capital. It's not a system of market exchange that has existed as long as there have been human beings. What it is a way of reshaping all political and social relations to foster the concentration of capital. It is it is not dissimilar in its current iteration, and obviously this is kind of a Yanis Varoufakis argument, to feudalism. Um, so capitalism is more than an economic system. It's a social and political system, and it's a self-replicating system. And it is a system that is based on endless crises. And whether it works, whether it works on the basis of people selling things to one another, or manufacturing, or in its first iterations in mercantile trade, and of course empire and slavery, it's designed to do one thing. And how it does it is kind of almost irrelevant. That's just a kind of like a secondary consideration. It's designed to create. It is designed to create concentrations of capital, ever greater concentrations of capital. And the fact that you have Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and all these guys who are, on and somewhere between being centi-billionaires and trillionaires, would indicate that it has the capacity and the design to do that. And of course, this involves mass impoverishment, environmental degradation, alienated, soulless work, and it also involves a series of stories that have to be told in order to justify all of this. And one of those stories is of the naturalness of capitalism, and the idea, and this is the key problem. I mean, of the many problems that there are associated to capitalism, this is the key one I'm trying to address in the thing that I'm writing, is the idea that people have that capitalism has kind of always existed since the dawn of time, and that what it is really the freedom of people to buy and sell things, to exchange things peer to peer. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Of course, people have always done that since the dawn of time. Read David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and you get a kind of a picture of that. However, capitalism has existed. It's a bit of a movable feast. 250 years, 300, 400 max. You might say that perhaps you could go all the way back to the kind of like the 1490s and Columbus and that kind of thing. Obviously, when what a key aggravating feature of Columbus's journeys and his murderous kind of colonization was that he was in debt. Just as the conquistadors were in debt, and they had to kill lots of people in the pursuit of paying back that debt. Debt being this kind of key feature of modern capitalist relations. Anyway, coming back to that slightly later. So this is just my way of kind of starting to talk about it, and I thought, well, there's the kind of best book out there at the moment about explaining capitalism in the sort of simplest terms, not patronizing, but also not written for a kind of like academic to academic discourse, but written to be accessible, was George Monbiot and Peter Hutchison's The Invisible Doctrine, The Secret History of Neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism in my book, The Rule of Capital, which I am currently writing at the moment, and honestly will kind of let you know when it's ready. The point about neoliberalism is just a simple iteration of capitalism. It is the kind of the latest version of it, and we're perhaps moving to something beyond that. The kind of technological tools available and the current sort of world economic environment is transporting us into what Yanis Varoufakis described as being techno-feudalism. There are aspects of Yanis Varoufakis' thesis which I'm still a bit not quite sure about, but the basic idea that class relations in the feudal era were based on rent extraction, and that the way that the super profits are made now by banks, by Wall Street and Silicon Valley, is basically through rent extraction. It's not through the kind of productive manufacturing capitalism that we might have associated with the kind of like the boom years of the mid 20th century. If you go back a few episodes and listen to the stuff I've been talking about suburbia, where you had a working class on upwardly mobile middle class incomes and lifestyles, and living in suburbia. Partly that was because what did they have? They had nice manufacturing jobs where you made stuff. And financialization and the sort of tech innovations that kill, along with the kind of the fiscal tools of neoliberalism, which have killed manufacturing, they don't then replace those sorts of jobs with kind of like Silicon Valley type tech jobs. Instead, what they do is they replace it with your smartphone, which is a means for kind of digital rent extraction, and they replace it with credit cards, which are a means of what's kind of like a financial rent extraction. Anyway, I'm going to read a bit from the book. Okay, and the first bit is just called The Anonymous Ideology, and here again this is a key and fascinating feature of neoliberalism: the fact that so many of us find it difficult to identify it and name it.
Here at Blue Apron, we know exactly how hectic school nights can be. That's why we created Assemble and Bake. Delicious one-pan meals that make family dinner simple. Just assemble the pre-chopped ingredients and put the pan in the oven to bake. Then you're free to help out with that last-minute diorama. Shop Assemble and Bake at BlueApron.com. Get 50% off your first 2 orders with code APRON50. Terms and conditions apply. Visit BlueApron.com/terms for more.
George Monbiot and Peter Hutchison write, Imagine that the people of the Soviet Union had never heard of communism. That's more or less where we find ourselves today. The dominant ideology of our times, which affects nearly every aspect of our lives, for most has no name. If you mention it, people are likely either to tune out or to respond with a bewildered shrug. What do you mean? What's that? Even those who have heard the word struggle to define it. Its anonymity is both a symptom and a cause of its power. It has caused or contributed to most of the crises that now confront us. Rising inequality, rampant child poverty, epidemics of disease and despair, offshoring and the erosion of the tax base, the slow degradation of healthcare, education and other public services, the crumbling of infrastructure, the democratic backsliding, the 2008 financial crash, the rise of modern-day demagogues such as Viktor Orban, Narendra Modi, Donald Trump, Boris Johnson and Jair Bolsonaro, our ecological crises and environmental disasters. We respond to these predicaments as if they occur in isolation. Crisis after crisis unfolds, yet we fail to understand their common roots. We fail to recognise that all these disasters either arise from or are exacerbated by the same coherent ideology, an ideology that has, or at least has had, a name: neoliberalism. Do you know what it is? So pervasive has neoliberalism become that we no longer even recognise it as an ideology. We see it as a kind of natural law, like Darwinian selection, thermodynamics, or even gravity, an immutable fact, a non-negotiable reality. What greater power can there be than to operate namelessly? But neoliberalism is neither inevitable nor immutable. On the contrary, it was conceived and fostered as a deliberate means of changing the nature of power. This is true. The most successful intellectuals of the 20th century, I believe, were the Mont Pelerin Society. They were the people like Hayek and von Mises and Roepke and people like that who got together initially in the 1930s and then after the Second World War and said, what do we do about the advance of state power? How do we return to a world of classical liberalism that existed before the First World War, and also to a world of imperialism, because there are deep imperial ideas embedded in neoliberalism, that there should be a kind of a world of producer countries, places that produce things like wheat or rice or tin or coal or copper. And those countries ideally shouldn't have trade unions. They shouldn't have national independence movements, because then what happens is you get people from Vietnam to Uganda who foolishly want their own resources and to use the wealth of those to build schools and hospitals for their own people. So there are deep kind of imperialist assumptions at the heart of neoliberalism, but it was an invented, created, and manufactured system created by people. And as David Graeber said, the simple truth of the world is that it's been made this way, and it can be made in other ways. And this is the kind of the emancipatory promise, really. So George Monbiot and Peter Hutchison write, what is neoliberalism? It's an ideology whose central belief is that competition is the defining feature of humankind. It tells us we are greedy and selfish, but that greed and selfishness light the path to social improvement, generating the wealth that will eventually enrich us all. The fact that it's been so successful in this kind of really sort of strange way of seeing the world, and that this is something that has been kind of propagated so successfully, often with the help of kind of very pliant sort of mass culture. I mean, I think the Apprentice, one of the other super toxic product of The Apprentice, is this one idea that ruthlessness and selfishness and self-interest and rampant hyper-individualism are the means by which not only can individuals benefit, but the wider society can somehow benefit too, through all this kind of economic activity that selfishness and greed generates. There was somebody I sort of talking in sort of humorous terms about the writings of Ayn Rand, and saying that it was incredible that an author had become so successful by pointing out that the central problem of humanity is that people aren't actually selfish enough, which is a nice one to reflect on, isn't it? It casts us as consumers rather than citizens. It seeks to persuade us that our well-being is best realized not through political choice, but through economic choice, specifically buying and selling. It promises us that by buying and selling, we can discover a natural meritocratic hierarchy of winners and losers. The market, it contends, will, if left to its own devices, determine who deserves to succeed and who does not. The talented and hardworking will prevail, whereas the feckless, the weak, and the incompetent will fail. The wealth the winners generate will trickle down to enrich the rest. And of course, we know that that's never happens. I think that somebody, I think it was Jason Hickel recently that published stats on trickle-down economics and says, well, it has never actually happened. Nothing has ever trickled down. And in fact, there's been a massive surge of wealth upwards. The other thing that Jason Hickel pointed out was that the kind of the inefficiency of this kind of red tooth and claw version of capitalism, where you get economic failure, companies that aren't profitable enough, is sort of punished through bankruptcy, and so you get these thousands of talented workers arbitrarily slung on the scrap heap. They have no power to prevent it, and a business that was operating suddenly kind of collapses because the people that own interests in the business recognize that it is more in their interests to sell their stake than to do anything else with it, or to mothball the company. And he said, that kind of destructiveness, or the fact that that happens at scale, and you get economic downturns and recessions, you get this kind of extraordinary irrationality and precarity that people have to live under, as if again they were medieval peasants worrying about poor harvests and things like that, and hoping that God or the gods or whoever wouldn't send them kind of a lack of rain or locusts. And that precarity is kind of baked into the system. And capitalism is often presented as being this kind of stable, logical order, but it's extremely chaotic, extremely unpredictable. My often, the often kind of, I think of, if we were to develop, perhaps this is never going to happen. I don't know. We've been fed a lot of fairy stories about this, but imagine AGI comes along, this kind of super intelligence, and the first thing anyone asks to them is, please redesign the global economic system. So basically, it works in the interests of the entire planet. It works environmentally within environmental limits, and it sort of skyrockets everyone's standards of living. So we're all living this kind of this is kind of this paradise. Assuming that's possible at all, it's not going to invent capitalism as we understand it to do that. Neoliberals argue that an active state seeking to change social outcomes through public spending and social programs rewards failure, fuels dependency, and subsidizes the losers. It creates an unenterprising society run by bureaucrats who stifle innovation and discourage risk-taking to the impoverishment of all. And of course, the ludicrousness of that is that if you look at the two, just take the examples of Britain and America, and there'll be a version of this wherever you live. The high point of social wealth, I'm not talking about kind of the wealth accrued in Wall Street, but if you look across society in America in, say, 1964, or Great Britain at around the same time, and you look at the wealth in communities in terms of the amenities they had, the access to healthcare, education, leisure facilities, green spaces, and if you look at the net wealth of working class people, middle class people, home ownership, savings, low levels of personal debt, these coincide. The richest lives that people lived in Western countries in the 20th century coincided at a moment of high state intervention during the Cold War, mainly because Western democracies needed to convince the working classes not to drift too far in the direction of the Soviet Union. So the the more markets are let off the loose, and markets are really just kind of unregulated market power. It just means unregulated oligarchic or capital or power of capital. The more that happens, the more wealth is centrifuged upwards, and you can chart that one on a graph. And as we've seen, so when the neoliberal age began in 1979 in Great Britain, 1980 in America, look at the stats on inequality. They skyrocket as the state is dismantled, because the state is, in the mid-century, the state might be many things, but it is a kind of a mediating system between people and capital. The role of governments, neoliberals claim, should be to eliminate the obstacles that prevent the discovery of the natural hierarchy. It just feels like a kind of a return to some sort of pre-democratic age. They must cut taxes, shed regulation, privatise public services, curtail protest, diminish the power of trade unions, and eradicate collective bargaining. So the states must be libertarian economically and authoritarian socially. They must shrink the state and blunt political action. In doing so, they will liberate the market, freeing entrepreneurs to generate the wealth that will enhance the lives of all. Once the market has been released from political restraints, its benefits will be distributed to everyone by means of what Adam Smith called the invisible hand. The rich, he claimed, are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution as of all the necessaries of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions amongst all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, without advance the interests of society. It's fair to say that it hasn't quite worked out like this. Over the past 40 years, during which neoliberalism prevailed both ideologically and politically, wealth, far from trickling down, has increasingly become concentrated in the hands of those who already possessed it. As the rich have grown richer, the poor have grown poorer, and extreme poverty and destitution now blight even the richest nations. And while the state might have deregulated finance and other commercial sectors, leaving their bosses free to behave as they wish, it has reasserted control over other citizens, intruding ever further into our lives as it stifles protest and restricts the scope of democracy. Okay, so that is The Invisible Doctrine, and it's a really good read it in a weekend kind of summation of neoliberalism, what it is and what it isn't. And there'll be more announcements coming up when I have really got some time to get this thing sort of putatively titled "The Rule of Capital" underway. Just to let you know a couple of things. Firstly, obviously, if you like this podcast and you value it, but you want to listen to it without adverts, hop on over to Patreon, and you can access it there. And also, we're running on the 26th of January, our first study day, and that's going to be for A-level students and equivalents around the world on the Russian Revolution. So check it out then. Take care, everybody. All the very best, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.